Hello and welcome to another episode of the StartUp MeetUp podcast with me, your host Matt Roberts as usual. Today with me I've got Dr. Rachel Smith, Senior Enterprise Manager at the Royal Academy of Engineering. Welcome. Thank you for coming on. Rachel's going to be talking about her journey at the next StartUp MeetUp, from founding scientist in the lab to boardroom of a multi-billion pound dollar, actually, isn't it? A $1 billion business. Yep. It all works, doesn't it? I mean, you know, who's splitting hairs? And so, really, without any further ado, Rachel, welcome. Would you like to just give us a little bit of an intro to you, your background, and kind of what got you started into science, really, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So I always loved science and English at school. And I remember when I was trying to choose my A-levels, and some of my kids are going through this now, trying to decide which ones to do, because I wasn't allowed to do both. Timetable wouldn't allow it. And I ended up going down the science route, but always slightly missed doing the English route. And this becomes a bit more important later, because that's where I really found my happy place, I suppose. So I did my science A-levels, and during that my dad bought me a book called The Ages of Gaia, which scared the living daylights out of me about the future of the planet and what we were doing to it. And I think from that point on, that's when I knew that I wanted to work in the environmental region, looking at things that would solve some of the big environmental problems we've got. So I finished my levels. I went to uni to do an environmental science degree. So it was a really rounded, covering all of the sciences, maths, statistics, a bit of law and politics, and really loved that. Looked for a job. Couldn't find a single one that interested me. So I carried on and did my master's, which was looking at energy conservation in the energy industry. Did that, loved it. That was at Cranfield. Again, looked for a job, interviewed for a couple, including a disastrous interview as a weather girl.
No way.
Absolutely awful. I'm not a natural in front of a camera. I learned that really early on. And so then, having not found a job that I was interested in, I decided to do my doctorate. So I signed up to a 4-year engineering doctorate at Cranfield, which was looking at recycling carbon fibre composites. Had an absolutely blast of a time, literally, in some cases. At one point, I was blowing things up in Northumberland with the Army to see how aeroplane wings and carbon fibre composites would work as blast mitigation. I was looking how they'd work in coral reefs, and I was turning them into activated carbon to treat wastewater. So, again, a really wide, varied scope of work. Left that and started working for a local charity. But within a couple of months, I was asked to be a founding scientist for a new startup called ITM Power. They had raised enough money for about 18 months to fund 2 of us to do some of the core R&D validation work, sort of proof of concept work. So I joined and didn't look back for 24 years.
Yeah, wow. So there's loads of questions really, about all of that. Because I'm a guy, my immediate interest goes to blowing stuff up in Northumberland. Did you have to do any kind of courses for that? Like, did you have to do any sort of? Because I assume, was it on in Northumberland? Where's their firing range? Is it like Mickle Fell or something like that?
Do you know what? I can't remember.
Yeah.
It was quite a long time ago, longer than I'd like to admit, probably. My memory's also probably slightly skewed because on the way I almost drowned my grandma in a canal by driving into a canal with my car.
Okay, so was that your first car, or was it like
it was a hire car that the university had hired for me to drive up from Cranfield to Northumberland, and it had done about 300 miles, I think, before I got it, and I wrote it off.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
And
anyway, your grandma, was your grandma all right?
She was fine. Yeah. She survived at least another few years. So
good.
It was all good. And the firemen and ambulance men said it could have happened to anybody.
Okay, good.
And we'll probably stop there. So I turned up to the army range slightly later than planned, and had to own up to all these big tufty army guys that what I'd actually done. And so they were very lovely to me. And so I've still got some of the shells that act as little vases at home. Nice. that we set off.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. So is any, like, do you know of any of that early research? Because obviously you said you were looking at kind of active carbon and like for water cleansing and things like that. Do you know if any of that has made it into mainstream products?
It didn't, no.
Right.
So one of the things I found was that the carbon fibres themselves didn't activate very well. So I couldn't get them to get a really, really high surface area. So the composite surrounding the fibres, really good activated carbon, but the fibres themselves, just too low to be of commercial value.
Still useful information, at least.
Useful
anyway,
information, and it got me my doctorate.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. So ITM, obviously, you know, that initial 18 months, tell me about that. Like, you mentioned that you were approached rather than going for the job. How was that? How did that work?
So at Cranfield, one of my lecturers, Don Highgate, was the founder of some novel polymer material that he was interested in looking at for electrochemical cells. He joined with actually my dad, who was doing his doctorate at the same time. So this was a really nice bit as well. So my dad was in his final year of his doctorate when I was in my first year of my doctorate at the same university, in a different school, looking at something completely different. But anyway, Don and my dad joined together with a guy called John Reeford, and the three of them founded ITM Power. So when they had raised enough money from angel investing, really, to fund the first 18 months of work, I knew, obviously, my dad really well, and I knew Don really well, and I'd done a bit of work with him previously on like a wood plastic that we were working on. So I was asked if I would consider joining alongside Simon Bourne, who is still the CTO for ITM. Simon was doing his doctorate at the same time as well at the same university, and actually we never met through the whole. I think his was maybe 3 years. But I would leave bits of polymer on my desk that my dad and I had made for Simon to test as part of his PhD, which was looking at ultrasonic non-destructive testing.
Right.
So we met kind of the first day of ITM, having been passing each other bits of plastic for a number of years.
I know your plastic. Nice. So at what point during that first 18 months then, did it become apparent that there was a more fully fledged business in that? Were you involved in any of the kind of fundraising, or was it more around proving not chemistry so much, but proving the technology? Yeah.
So I think I never doubted that it would work. I'm always optimistic about everything, and I mean, that has served me quite well. Things don't tend to go wrong, which is good. Or maybe I just don't look at the things that go wrong. So what Simon and I were doing was looking at really proving the longevity of the material. So the original work had come out of a university spin out, which Don had bought. And so we already knew that there was, you know, the ability to work in an electrochemical cell, very, very low current density. But there was no data about longevity. It had literally, you know, worked for maybe a few minutes, and that was it. So quite early on, we'd kind of set out to go, okay, actually, what are we going to need to do to be able to get people to invest serious money in this so we can actually really take it forward? You know, clean tech stuff is never going to be low cost to develop, and it's never going to be quick. And so we'd set a target for 500 hours, working as an electrochemical cell, which sounds quite easy, but that's 500 continuous hours, which means you need some testing equipment that will operate for 24 hours a day for a long period of time. So part of what we were doing was looking at actually how could we make the cells so that they would operate. How could we test the cells, and where could we test them? So we ended up testing down at Shrivenham University, which is down near Oxford Way, partly because at the time we were using radiation to cure the polymers, and they also had a radiation source. which is a really bizarre room to go into. And I remember Simon and I used to joke about turning into Spider-Man because there were spiders sometimes in the corner of the rooms, and you're like, these have been exposed to radiation. If we get bitten like this, could be so cool. Anyway, we never got bitten and we never got locked in, but it was always a fear of mine.
You could go hunting for one that's got like a special symbol on its back or something like that, right?
Yeah, I'm so close to being a superhero. So I spent a huge amount of time down in Shrivenham, as well as, we moved the company up to Sheffield in 2002. So we set up our first labs in what was the old airport at Sheffield.
Oh, right, okay.
So my first office was actually immigration and arrivals.
Nice.
And our first labs were the baggage handling area that looked out onto the runway. So by the end of that 18 months, well, in fact, it wasn't the end. Within about a year, I think it was, we'd made an electrolyser that was about that big.
Oh, wow.
And we'd operated it for over 500 hours.
Nice.
And actually, the testing equipment meant that we pretty much had to stay with it all the time. So we would be doing, checking in every few hours and swapping night shifts.
Is it still recording?
It was like, oh my God. So it was, that was great. So that was really kind of enough evidence that we felt we could go out and raise more money.
Yeah.
Our CEO at the time, Jim Heathcote, was an ex-City guy. And so we said, right, actually, we do a flotation, and I'm confident that I can raise some money. So Simon and I did a lot of the work kind of with the technical due diligence that you have to go through. So talking through, exactly what we'd done and proving, all the different things that we were claiming were true. And then we raised 10 million on the stock market on a name flotation. Wow. And that was in 2004.
That must have been a mad time.
It was, but it got madder.
I bet it did.
We thought it was mad, and then we found out what mad really was.
So, there's a couple of questions. Just coming back to something you mentioned earlier, which is around attitude. Like, so, if you... Whether you call it looking on the positive side of things and expecting that it will all work out in the end, or whether you see that as resilience or something else, I think you need a little bit of that, don't you? As like a small part, as a member of a small founder team, you need quite a bit of a positive outlook in terms of, well, that happened, but actually we can take something from that and turn it into something that then is useful for the next thing that we're doing or whatever else.
Yeah, and I think my favourite word for that is tenacity.
Yes.
And so I was not the brightest at school. I wasn't, the fastest at doing work or, any of those things. But I was tenacious. And I remember going home one time during A-levels when my maths A-level tutor had said to me, are you really sure that you want to do this? Because actually we're not sure you're going to do that well. And I remember talking to my dad and going, but if I don't do maths, then I feel like I'm not going to be able to do what else I want to do. And he just said, it's completely up to you. Ignore the noise. Yeah. If you want to do it, you do it. And if you don't do it. But who's to tell you what you should or what you shouldn't do?
Yeah, exactly. As long as you're going to learn something from it.
And I decided, actually, no, I do want to do this. And even if I don't get a great result, I'll know that I've tried my hardest at it, and that's okay. And actually, that was the highest A-level result that I got in maths,
nice.
Which still wasn't brilliant, I have to say. But, it was perfectly passable.
I definitely shot lower than I should have done.
But when I was doing my doctorate, my now husband, but my partner at the time, damaged his back building, and so ended up flat on his back for a number of months, and we had to completely rethink his career. And so I got a job at a local estate agent's, and I really didn't think I'd get it. So it was a weekend job because I'd bought a house off this guy beforehand, and I'd lost it because they decided to sell it to someone else. So then I'd had quite a confrontation about, actually, you should have given me a chance to put another offer in, everything else. Anyway, it had all fallen through. And then they came back to us about a month later saying, do you still want it? And we ended up buying this house. And I got the job, and the guy said, I've never met anyone with as much tenacity as you have.
Oh, really? Wow.
And that's what we want to be employing. So even though we'd had this really big fallout, Actually, he saw something that, he thought was valuable for his business.
And it's something that you can't, it's very hard to teach, isn't it? It's very hard to, like, all of the technical stuff, when someone's coming for a job interview or looking to start in a business, then, the delivery, how you do what you do is trainable, is teachable.
Yeah.
The soft things like tenacity, ability to communicate, all of those sorts of things, personality, like you can't coach that, right? And so it needs to fit. You
can make the environment as helpful as possible to encourage that, and that's definitely something that we try to do within ITM, particularly in the early years when a lot of the things that we tried to do, we knew we were pushing the boundaries, and we knew that actually we need to be able to fail at some of these things, otherwise we haven't pushed it hard enough, and if we don't fail, then we're not exploring enough. And so actually being able to say to people, we expect some of these things to fail, and that's fine. And actually, but what you'll have done is you'll have learnt a boundary, you'll have learnt not to use something in the future, and actually we want to fail fast, so push it fast, and it's not a problem.
And also recognising that it was a phrase, I can't remember who it was that I heard use it recently, but it's not unique, but it's failing. Failing doesn't make you a failure, right? There's value in all of that.
Yeah. It means you tried something that was difficult.
Absolutely.
And maybe impossible, which might be why you failed.
Absolutely. And also possibly no one else has ever tried in the world before. And so everyone's grown through that experience, right? Coming back to then, so like you floated on the stock market, you've had a raging success. It's like £10 million is now in the business. Your job must have changed like night and day in that, right? Yeah.
So we then started looking at recruitment, and that was a whole new learning experience in itself. We took recruitment incredibly seriously. I think the knowledge that actually if you get the wrong people in, particularly early on, it can be absolutely disastrous. So our interview process took about 2 days. We would have people up, we would do kind of the formal interview bit, with a bit of a panel. We would give them a bit of an impossible question to answer, knowing that, there's no way they would know the answer, but they would have to make some assumptions, some sensible assumptions, but, and then some guesses to try and get to an answer. And it was really to look at, is this somebody who's comfortable being uncomfortable? Because actually we knew that what we were going to do was going to make people uncomfortable. They were going to have to try things and fail. They were going to have to do things without knowing all of the answers, and they were going to have to make some sensible guesses and have a decent judgment to be able to do things. And so I remember some of them looking at us kind of going, oh my God, I don't even want to come and work for you. And that's fine.
But don't join a startup early,
then,
right? Exactly.
And others absolutely revelled in it. And then we knew that they were the right type of people to come and join us. So we grew from 2 of us to about 70 over the next probably 3 years. We didn't take all 70 on in one go. I think kind of 7 or 12 was our first round, and and then we would do it in kind of chunks of 10-ish. I
mean, you must you can't have too many people come into the business. Certainly in the early days, like when you've been such a tight team, then having too many people come in like kind of destroys a lot of that, doesn't it?
And so it was stepping that up, and then once people were settled, then we would go, right, actually we can help, these people can help us integrate the next round of people. And I think actually up until 70, there was, although 70 sounds like a lot of people, we all knew each other, and we did a lot of social things together as well. We all tended to be reasonably young, I suppose. Most of us hadn't started having children at that point, so you could actually, and we just worked really late, and people would come in at weekends because they wanted to check on an experiment. There was that kind of environment and atmosphere, which is. I didn't realise until after how special that was. But it
energising as well.
It really was.
Playing, like, not to kind of put ITM Power and like energising in the same place, but it breeds success. It breeds the same sort of commitment from everyone, right? The more people see people doing that,
then we're generally excited to be part of what we were trying to do. it was great. And yes, I had to move from, actually doing stuff in the lab to looking at the strategies of what should people be doing in the lab, and then dealing with some of the HR issues as well, and looking after patent stuff, and then I looked at so once our core patents had been granted, we looked at how could we extend the runway of the money that we'd raised. And so we started looking at grant funding, and that worked incredibly well for ITM. We did more fundraisers after. I think in total we raised about 400 million on the stock market, through different stages and different times for different things. But then we also raised. So I was looking after applications and project delivery of about 100 million of grant funding over that sort of 15, 20 years. Yeah. So I think where we were really quite strategic about what we chose to do. Yeah. Occasionally I would get a bit sidetracked by, look, there's a big pot of money here. Yeah. But actually maybe once or maybe twice that we did that took us away from actually the core path of where we wanted to go. We realised it was a mistake. And so we were then very tight about what grants we would go for. And I think that's really important, because particularly when you're starting a business, and ITM was very lucky, we were well resourced, but what I see now is the temptation just to go after money can be really high, and actually that can be a costly distraction instead of a helpful hand. So absolutely. One of my guests at the back end of last year helps businesses with grant applications and does a lot of work with Business Sheffield and Enterprise in Barnsley, and she was saying exactly that, right? You need to look at what the grant fund is looking for as an outcome, and whether that aligns with what you want your business to be, because otherwise you're going to spend a lot of time satisfying the outcomes of the grant funding that doesn't actually move your desires for your business forward. So I would then only go for a grant with a maximum of kind of 10% distraction cost. Would be my rule. And actually the grant writing is where I kind of brought this English back into my science. And so I would spend a lot of time working with, some of the core leading scientists and engineers within the company, looking at what did they want to do over the next 5 years. Not what they were doing now, because that's too late to get funded, but what's the next thing and the next thing. And then writing that into a story that took a grant body along with us, where they could see the value in it. So I had... there's got to be a narrative, hasn't there? There's got to be something that explains what it is you're doing and where you're trying to get to. Interesting. So then, obviously, as you've said, ITM grew and grew and got more and more successful. How did your role change then within that? So you've moved from looking after experiments to then looking after teams, and then teams of teams, I would imagine. And then ultimately you were in the boardroom. How did that manifest? So I mean, I think despite having been with the same company for 24 years almost, my job was never the same for more than 2. And I think that's something I really, really loved about sort of that startup and scale up environment. There was not a single day I was bored or not outside of my comfort zone in some way. I built up an R&D team. So I was spending a lot of time doing the grant applications and grant project delivery. So handed over the R&D function. Then by the time we'd got a few different projects going, it became too much just for me to manage, so started building up a project delivery team and project management team. We then incorporated that in with the sales, so it became a much bigger function, because by then ITM had got some commercial sales as well. And really from then, it was almost like the company grew really, really fast. We got up to about 450 people in total. Wow. And so there would be pockets of, a new department that would need developing, which I would then go into, or, somewhere where there was a problem, something wasn't quite working, or, things were getting a bit siloed. So I would tend to jump around from, area to area to try and solve whatever issues we were growing and developing in those different functions. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed building up teams that felt like they were empowered to deliver on different things. Right. I'm not particularly want to micromanage. I don't like being micromanaged myself. I like people to trust what I'm doing and know that actually if I don't know what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask, and so I would try and instill that in my teams as well of, I'm here to help and support you. I'm not here to tell you what to do.
Absolutely. You're the ones who are going to find out how to do this.
You're the ones who are experts in it, And actually that was one of the things that felt quite uncomfortable as we grew, that I wasn't an expert in the different areas that I was looking after, and having to absolutely trust, your team to be able to be on top of that.
That's where that empowerment comes in as well. If they feel like absolutely. They've got that agency to have control and be the voice that gets listened to, then actually they're much more likely to take responsibility for that and make sure that they've done the diligence.
Absolutely did. It's I had some absolutely amazing people, and we built some brilliant teams that did some great stuff. And people enjoyed what they were doing. Again, it was. The mission of ITM was something that people believed in and wanted to carry forward.
I did see on one of the last roles that you did at ITM was Director of Special Projects. And is that kind of your version of Skunkworks? Is that like sort of super clandestine? You had like a lab that was all locked off and no windows.
It probably sounds way more exciting than that it was. So I joined the board. I sat on the board for 8 years, which again was an amazing experience, and worked with some, brilliant CEOs, brilliant NEDs, and learned a huge amount about the wider business area. So then, and it was always quite difficult to know what I should be called actually. So, Simon was really obviously the CTO, Andy and previous CFOs were really obviously the CFO, but kind of what was I? I was an extra floating part that would float, floating director or something. And so, I just ended up being, okay, I'm just a director, because then actually that still gives me the freedom to go in and do, whatever needs to be done. When I stepped down from the board, we had a big grant project from Bays, which was looking at increasing our manufacturing capability and looking at bringing different technologies into that and doing quite a big field trial. And so that was one of the projects that I took on. We'd had to have a change of strategy. That if anybody looks at our share price history, they'll see, it's like a roller coaster. And it kind of matches, the hype of hydrogen, and then it kind of dropped down, and then there was another big hype. And at that point, we were valued at, I think it was like 3.5 billion. Wow. It was crazy. And so, at that point, when it looked like there were going to be big markets, and so we were, right, we need bigger stacks, we need bigger this, we need to go massive. And so we'd got a grant fund for that. And then actually, the downturn started as we were going through that, and end users became much more risk adverse. And so we had to pivot that project into, instead of developing a brand new stack, it was actually, how do we make more of the not the previous version, but kind of the same size and therefore the same risk portfolio as far as customers were concerned. How do we make more of them and more reliably? And so that big strategy discussion and pivot meant that obviously the funding body got slightly more nervous about actually, you're now looking at doing something reasonably different. Not different enough that it meant it was out of scope. But it needed an oversight, and so actually I took over the oversight of that project, which was multidisciplinary, working with almost every single department within the organisation, from electrochemistry, stack manufacturing, field trial and deployment, field teams, and after sales care and everything. And so, having worked in so many different areas of the business and had that sort of kind of director oversight, I could come in and I could manage that project. And so I think that made ITM feel much more comfortable, and it also made the funding body feel more comfortable.
You mentioned there about stock price and how that affected what the business was looking at. Something that's always challenged me, I think, around the relationship between share price and business as usual, I guess, really is the more relevant thing, is that you're not making anything different. You're not delivering anything different. There's no less value in what is being delivered by the company. How does then that, like, the distraction of then having to look at share price and match what the business is doing, or at least react in a certain way to share price, how much effort does that take out of your day as a director?
So I think it would depend, and actually that reaction to what you're doing changed as well throughout the history of ITM. So in the very early days, after we first floated, the first few years, we would be working on targets that we had set publicly in the market. Right, we're going to get 1,000 hours longevity, we're going to build a 5 kilowatt stack, or whatever it was that we'd set. And so we would then put out RNSs or releases that gave an update on kind of technical progress, and we would see a jump in the share price, and that was really gratifying. You kind of go, yes, people see the value in what I've done. But that got to a certain stage, and then the market would kind of go, yeah, okay, well, we now know your technology's working. Where are your sales? And so then no matter what we did, in our R&D team or our research team, it didn't impact the share price. And then that felt a bit disheartening, because I'd personally put so much value on, the reaction of the market, that it then kind of felt, do people not appreciate what we, this is an amazing result. It was that validation. And so kind of having to pivot out of that mindset and kind of go, right, actually, forget the distraction of that share price. Actually, this is your long-term path. And if you know the steps to get to where you need to get to, then actually you have to be your own validation now. You can't rely on the applause of your parents anymore.
No, absolutely.
So that was more challenging. But I think, again, because of the way ITM is and the kind of technologies that we're talking about, they're very capital intensive. Factories are expensive things to build. Stacks and stack testing equipment is expensive stuff to build. So we couldn't ignore the share price, because we knew that there would be further fundraisers that we needed to do. And you need to try and get that value as high as you reasonably can in order to be able to do that fundraise successfully, and get the excitement in the market again. And I think one of the things that our CEOs were really great at was about being able to tell that story, the current story and the future potential.
Right.
And that meant that actually we were successfully fundraising when we went out.
Without torpedoing what you're currently doing as well, I guess, is a tricky line to walk. I mean, I guess you must look at some stuff that CEOs of floated companies put out as press statements, or how I would say in interviews, and just go, what have you done there? You've just completely wiped out a whole department.
And there's so much due diligence that you have to go through when you're doing a fundraise as well. And Simon and I had learnt that with our original AIM flotation, but then every time we did one, and there were maybe 3 or 4 significant fundraisers, over the next 20 years, you'd have to go down to exactly the same level of detail. Every single thing that you said was fact-checked and interrogated by the lawyers, and, okay, you can't say that. I know it's true, but you can't evidence it, you can't say it. And you're like, okay, then, so being really, really careful.
Absolutely.
About what you say.
Rachel, I would love to carry on talking about all sorts of different stuff, especially we didn't even get onto how you're now working with the Royal Academy of Engineering, and I think you're doing some stuff with the Triangle Mentor Network, is that right? And things like that. But I do have to wrap it up. There's one more question. I don't know if you've watched any of the podcasts before, but I have one question that I always have to ask all of my guests, and that's, Rachel, what is your ultimate sandwich? Oh, goodness.
Okay, this was not... this is probably the trickiest question you've asked. Do you know what? It completely depends on the day. But overall, my go-to would be cheese and Marmite in a baguette.
Wow.
With a side of crisps.
Nice. So, right, there's loads. Marmite. No one's ever said Marmite before on a sandwich. I've done maybe 16, 17 of these, and like Marmite's the first ingredient.
Well, I guess you either love it or you hate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's on the advertising, isn't it? Why Marmite?
Why not Marmite? I don't know. I mean, I always thought cheese and Marmite was like a standard staple.
Yeah, it is.
But,
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I enjoy it, but like, I don't think it's to everyone's taste.
No. Well, I don't like butter, and so
okay.
Yeah, Marmite just helps give that
a little bit of moist in there or something.
Bit of
well,
something
moist is a good word.
extra. It really is. Never use that again.
So, like your baguette, are you going for a fresh baguette from the
absolutely fresh
from the supermarket or from a baker?
Well, my go-to would be Marks and Spencer's. So during my A-levels, I worked in the food department in Marks and Spencer's, and at the end of your shift, when it was closing up time, you could get discounted food. So I developed a real taste for Marks and Spencer's food at that point, which I then couldn't carry on through my student life.
It's not sustainable.
But it wasn't sustainable, but I got it early. Marks and Spencer's baguette, and grated cheese, bit of Marmite.
Okay, lovely.
Yeah.
Lovely. Crisps. There's like the guy who was helping me set up the cameras actually today. He had a crisp sandwich, was his ultimate sandwich. What flavour crisps are you going with?
With the cheese and Marmite, I would go ready salted.
He goes for ready salted. Plain,
if I was just having a cheese, if I was just going for a crisp sandwich, it would be cheese and onion.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I see. I'm always salt and vinegar. I like the kind of acidity with the cheese, and then yeah. That's good. Thank you very much, Rachel.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, that's all we've got time for this episode. Thank you for watching, and you can catch Rachel with her talk at the next Startup Meetup, which is going to be on April the 9th down at Spiral City in Barnsley. As always, we're on the second Thursday of every month. You can find tickets on Eventbrite. I'll put the link in the description below. Other than that, thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you, Matt.